Hey lady, welcome to the Grit, Growth, Grace podcast. If we haven't met, my name is Anne Marie. I'm wife to James and mom to 4 beautiful kids, plus 1 miscarried baby, from 9 months up to 8 years. My hope is to help other women experience the postpartum period, all the way up through the first year of baby's life, as a time of grit, growth, and grace.
This is episode 23. Hey lady, I'm a little under the weather today, which is why my voice is a little deeper and my nose is a little stuffy sounding. That's because it is. But let's carry on with my personal experience of using the Creighton and Marquette methods of natural family planning, or NFP, also known as fertility awareness methods, specifically during the postpartum period. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of my personal experience, I want to zoom out a little bit and look at why the modern evidence-based FAMs, fertility awareness methods or methods of NFP, use the biomarkers that they do. And biomarkers may sound a little complicated, but it's really just a fancy way of saying observable signs of things that are happening in your body. Biomarkers for fertility awareness methods include cervical mucus observations. They can include cervical position ovulations, meaning is your cervix soft and up high, or is it firm and down low, depending on where you are in your cycle. So cervical position, cervical mucus, basal body temperature, which is the lowest resting temperature of your body. What else? You can do urinary hormone testing, and that tests for both estrogen and it tests for the breakdown products of estrogen and LH, or luteinizing hormone, in your body as well. And the reason those matter is because estrogen rises specifically before ovulation, though it does have a second and smaller rise after ovulation. But in every ovulatory cycle, you will have this big rise of estrogen, and then you'll have the LH surge. So you had a follicle with an egg in it that was maturing for the whole first part of your cycle. And then the LH surge triggered ovulation, which just means that mature egg within the follicle ruptured and it released that mature egg, so that if sperm is present, if it's in the vicinity, fertilization could occur. So some methods will use LH testing, like with the Marquette method, because that LH surge is what triggers ovulation. So presumably, if you've had an LH surge, you have had ovulation, or are about to have ovulation within 36 hours of when you see that LH surge. Typically is when ovulation occurs. So this is why you would chart with an evidence-based FAM. This is why you would chart one of these or more than one of these different biomarkers, because you will see specific changes in them over the course of your cycle. Some that are consistent with the pattern of infertility and some that are consistent with the pattern of fertility. And I don't mean infertility as in you are unable to get pregnant for 6 months or more. I just mean within your cycle, the part of your cycle where you are infertile versus the part of the cycle where you are fertile. So the different biomarkers that these methods track are simply trying to help you gauge, okay, where am I in relation to ovulation, which would be the fertile part of my cycle. Cervical mucus only methods, which would include Billings ovulation method, and Creighton is probably the 2 most familiar ones. Those just track what they sound like, cervical mucus. And then you have symptothermal methods like the couple-to-couple lig method, and I believe also Sensiplan and Symptopro and maybe a couple of others, but CCL is the one that I know the most about. And that includes tracking your basal body temperature and then also your cervical mucus. And there's an optional third sign you can check, which would be your cervical position. So close to ovulation, it's going to move up a little bit, actually higher and soften in your body. And then when you are infertile, like when you've moved to the infertile part of your cycle after ovulation, it actually gets a little firmer and drops down lower. So that's interesting, but that is all part of the symptothermal method. And then the symptohormonal method would be Marquette Method primarily. And that one can be monitor only, or it can be monitor and mucus observations. Though actually what's interesting is that in studies, they found that the monitor only is actually a little bit more effective for preventing pregnancy. And while that might seem a little counterintuitive at first, it actually makes some sense when you consider that if you have conflicting readings, you are going to pick one over the other, and you probably are going to pick the one that aligns most with what you want the answer to be. So I thought that was interesting that when they had done studies, and these aren't super recent, but in the last 10 years, I believe, when they had studied which was more effective using the Marquette Method monitor, which is a clear blue fertility monitor only, that was actually more effective for preventing pregnancy than for using monitor plus cervical mucus observations. So just that interesting little tidbit. And then actually there's the Boston cross-check method, which is interesting because it essentially looks at all the different biomarkers as tools in your tool belt or in your toolbox and says you can have a cross-check. So you can have a primary biomarker that you use, but then you can use a cross-check. So maybe you're doing basal body temperature and you're doing Marquette Method testing, or you could mix and match. Essentially, the Boston cross-check offers greater flexibility because you can mix and match the biomarkers that you choose to track. So that's kind of interesting. I've only heard about the Boston cross-check method in the last couple of years, but I like the flexibility that can offer as well. And then it's probably important to touch briefly on why postpartum is so darn tricky, certainly can be if you're breastfeeding, for figuring out what your fertility is or is not. And we'll get into it more specifically in my personal experience with what was frustrating to me about both the Creighton Method and the Marquette Method. But in a nutshell, when you are breastfeeding, your estrogen levels can rise and they can fall. And they can do that in all sorts of patterns for shorter or longer durations throughout the course of your breastfeeding. Now, because estrogen rise has to happen in order to have fertile cervical mucus, you can see what's starting to look like fertile cervical mucus, and then it can go away again without your period coming, just as a drop in your estrogen levels. But of course, no ovulation occurred. But if you are tracking your mucus and you see, oh, that seems like maybe it's heading towards fertile mucus, if we're trying to avoid pregnancy, okay, well, then we need to abstain during that time. And then any method that's using that is going to have a protocol about how long you have to wait after the last day that you see fertile appearing mucus, excuse me, just coughing, before you would have sex again. So there's that. And if you are tracking your basal body temperature, that can actually not be very reliable either during that time, because basal body temperature requires you to have essentially a certain amount of hours in a row that you're sleeping. And surprise, if you are postpartum, especially early on, what are the odds that you're getting consistently 4 hours or more stretches of sleep at a time? Probably not very high. And so for that reason, even symptothermal methods like the couple-to-couple leg method will have a modified protocol during postpartum that specifically tracks your mucus observations without relying on temperature changes. Because normally you would ovulate and then you would have a progesterone rise after and a significant rise in your basal body temperature. But when your cycles have not yet returned, you can see a rise and fall, probably not a significant one necessarily, but you can see a fluctuation in your temperature readings without relation to your fertility. So that's why they don't track that during postpartum until your cycles have returned and you can count on those readings. And then even with symptohormonal methods like the Marquette method, where you're just tracking your pee and it should be objective, right? It should be objective. Even with those, that fluctuating estrogen level can lead to a high reading. And then because the method monitor is reverse engineered for Marquette, it's actually the clear blue monitor was created to help women get pregnant, not to help them avoid pregnancy. So the whole method relies on kind of reverse engineering the way that the monitor was designed to work. And so when it detects a rise in estrogen, it will continue to read high until it notices peak, which would be consistent with or close to ovulation, right? But what about if there is no ovulation? That is the difficulty too. So Each of the evidence-based modern methods of FAMs or NFPs uses certain biomarker observations. The very most important thing you need to learn, because I'm not here to tell you how to do the nitty-gritty of each of these methods, but the most important thing you need to know from today is whatever method you are interested in, you need to find an instructor in that method. Postpartum is not the right time to try to DIY a method, especially if you would say, I don't have the budget right now to have another baby. If you don't have the budget to have another baby, you definitely need to make room in the budget for an instructor, because they will be familiar with how to apply the protocols specific to postpartum for your method. So that's probably enough on the overview kind of NFP methods and what it is that they track. But I think it's really beautiful that the design in our bodies is so marvelous, but also so predictable that we are able to say, okay, we can track our fertility through following these different readings, observations, test results, and that sort of thing. So I think it's really beautiful that our bodies are so intelligently designed, but also intelligible, that we can make sense of what it is that our bodies are communicating to us when we are trained to do so. So, all right, let's get into my experience postpartum with both the Creighton Method and the Marquette Method. Now, Creighton I used for, 3 postpartum periods, and my cycle came back at 3.5 months after my first was born. And that had to do with working full time as a day shift nurse in the ICU. And then after my second child, my daughter was born, it came back, I think it was closer to 5 months with her. And I had decreased my work schedule at that time, so I was down to part-time. And then when my third was born, so I had had a miscarriage by then, but when my third child was born, I had return of fertility about 6 months. And then with Luke, the youngest, it came back right about 7.5 months. So I don't know that that's particular to, or that that's relevant for all women, that longer and longer return of fertility. But in my case, I will say that as I was working less aggressively, more at home, and then just fewer hours, I did notice that my return of fertility has spaced out after each of my subsequent pregnancies. You might be wondering for yourself, especially if you've never, if this is your first postpartum period, well, when's my cycle going to return? And girl, I wish I knew. I wish I could tell you. And here's what I think is kind of, I don't know, it's a little sad, but it's also perhaps funny, and maybe will help you laugh a little bit. But I was talking to a doctor about the mirror monitor, which I'll talk about in a minute more, but I was talking to him about it, and he was saying basically there are 3 kinds of women when it comes to return to fertility after having a baby. There are the ones whose fertility will return right away no matter what. And I know that can happen because it has happened to my sister twice now, where even though she was breastfeeding, even though her kids were not yet sleeping through the night, her period came back both times by 8 weeks. So there's that. There's type 1 women. And that's a fairly small percentage, right? And then there's another set of women, type 2 women, I'll call them, and their fertility won't come back for a very long time, 12 months plus. And some of that is going to be related to how they're feeding the baby, right? Like how long the stretches are in between feedings, but also if they're pacifying baby at the breast and that sort of a thing. But you're going to have this percentage of women who maybe no matter what, but especially under these certain circumstances, they are going to see a delayed return of fertility for 12 months, maybe longer, maybe 18. And then there are the rest of us, which may very well be you, but it is also definitely me. And that's we're somewhere between 8 weeks and 12 months. So in case that helps you at all in a bell curve, it seems that there are a very small percentage of women on one side of the curve who are 8 weeks or less right away. And then at the very opposite end of the bell curve, a percentage of women who are going to see 12, 18, long time before they get their period back. And then most of us are going to be somewhere in the middle. The nice thing about charting Creighton during postpartum is that you only have to track one thing, cervical mucus. The hard thing about tracking cervical mucus postpartum is, one, that the Creighton method requires you to check so often. Every single time before you go to the bathroom, after you go to the bathroom, before you get in the shower, after you get in the shower, and before you go to bed. Maybe when you get up in the morning too, I can't remember that one. But of course you probably pee, so that's irrelevant. But that is a lot of checks to do, especially if you are tired, especially if you just don't feel like it. So great that there is just one thing to check, but how often you have to check during postpartum, I think can be frustrating and a challenge. And also, like, do you really have to check every single time? And then sort of that anxiety of like, well, just how important is it? So there's that. And then the other thing that was complicating for me was that for many years I experienced continuous mucus. So of course, right, your mucus cannot always be fertile, but if you are always seeing some type of mucus, then you have to be able to differentiate fertile appearing versus infertile appearing. And what I found in the 2 cycles before we conceived my 4th child was that my mucus signs were a little wonky. So it's a little hard for me to know because, right, 1, that was a long time ago, but 2, I just can't be sure. I'm not sure if we conceived him because I was fertile when I thought the fertile window had closed, or if it was just the fact that we used Peak Plus 3 because we had used that for 7 years and never conceived a baby. But the postpartum but the protocol for Creighton says you should wait till the 4th day after your presumed peak day based on your cervical mucus observations. And we definitely waited just till the 3rd day. So I don't know if my entire observations were off the cycle that we conceived, or if it was just that, no, if we had waited one more day based on their protocol, that would have made all the difference. And frankly, we have our son, right? And because we've been charting my cycle for so long, we are aware that sex makes babies. Does it always make babies? No. But we are certainly aware that that's where babies come from. And so there's something, and I don't mean to say that flippantly, but there's something to be said for learning to chart your cycle, for learning to understand the relationship between your body and your fertility and sex and the massive creative potential that that has, that if you do experience a pregnancy, that you recognize, I know where that came from. I know where that came from. So yes, we weren't trying to conceive in the cycle, like we weren't specifically trying to conceive in the cycle that we created my son, but we also know that sex is where babies come from. And so it shifted something in our hearts to be able to more easily receive him, I think, than it would have been if we had been on hormonal birth control, for instance, and been actively trying to prevent a pregnancy. I think when you use fertility awareness, you have just a different approach to sex, to babies, to life. And so all of that, I think, makes a difference. And maybe that sounds a little more philosophical than practical, but it's just been my experience. So yeah, let's see. How long did we avoid pregnancy between my first and second kids? They are 20 months apart. So if my cycle came back at 3.5 months, I think we avoided pregnancy for like 7 cycles and then conceived when my first was 10 months old. But then after my daughter, if you've listened to the first couple of episodes of this podcast, you know that we waited quite a while, 3.5 years after she was born to conceive again. And then we miscarried, and then we got pregnant 3 months again after that with my 3rd child. So we used the method for years continuously and effectively to prevent pregnancy. And I guess here's the other thing I want to say too, kind of along the lines of like knowing where babies come from. And that's this. When you are on birth control, you're taking hormonal contraception, you are either, well, you're clearly not trying to get pregnant, but you're very definitely trying not to get pregnant, right? Whereas when you use fertility awareness, you may be actively TTA, trying to avoid, or TTC, trying to conceive. But there's a middle ground of TTW, trying to whatever. And that just means that while you're not actively seeking to get pregnant, you're now also not purposefully avoiding it per se. You're just sort of kind of open. And that's not possible when you're on birth control. On birth control, like you have your finger on the switch and are like, switch is off. But with TTW, trying to whatever, there can be a little bit more leeway. There can be a little bit more nuance, openness to openness to spontaneity, I guess. And yeah, it's a different mindset. It's a different approach to the one that hormonal birth control presumes. So that's how I think you can explain on the one hand that we avoided pregnancy successfully for, years after my daughter, because we had a reason to do that. But then after my son was born, my third child, and then we got pregnant 10 months later again, because my first two are 20 months apart. My second two are 20 months apart. So we got pregnant again at about 10 months with my youngest. I think that's how you can have a method that kind of includes all that. If it had been super important to me to know exactly what my mucus was telling me and why it was confusing and what to do, then I could have reached out to an instructor. And frankly, I didn't because it wasn't important enough to me. That is an option, but it was not important enough to me. So 3 kids, I had Creighton use postpartum. But after my 4th child, I was like, no, I want to switch methods. I've had continuous mucus. The cycle that I conceived, like I said, had been wonky mucus observations, and so had the cycle before it. And I just thought this would be so much easier if I just switched to the Marquette method because it's going to be objective. All I have to do is pee and then test my pee, and it's going to be so straightforward. That was a little delusional. And I didn't even know it. So here's what I found. I started testing at, I think, 8 weeks postpartum. I think that's right. And I had pretty much all low readings, like several months of all low readings. And then one day, when I was 4 months postpartum, I got a high reading. And I got 2 full months of high readings. For the mathematically challenged among us, that is 60 days of, according to the protocol, abstinence. And I was furious for multiple reasons. 1, because a method that requires 60 days of abstinence and is unable to differentiate if you are actually fertile or not is just extremely expensive abstinence. And if I had wanted that, then I could have saved myself $1 a day, so over $60 in test sticks, right, for the exact same outcome. So I was frustrated with that, but here's how that can happen. I was telling you earlier, if your estrogen rises, right, and then falls again, and rises and then falls again, well, the machine, the Clear Blue fertility monitor that they have a protocol for with the Marquette method, it's only going to keep reading high until you get, I think, 20 days in a row, and then it will automatically reset if it has not detected the LH surge that would lead to a peak reading. And within the Marquette protocol for postpartum, you do a reset yourself every 10 days of high readings. But still, if your estrogen has gone up and down but come back up in that time, or if it's just reading high, like it's just reading high on its own continuously, you don't know if that's real or not, meaning like really the fertile mucus that's preceding the real first ovulation. And so you have to abstain during that time. And it took about 2 months before I think the monitor actually calibrated to my levels of estrogen. And then all of a sudden it just went down. And it stayed down then for another month and a half before my actual return of fertility, which means a series of high readings followed by a peak. And then, however many days later my period came. So that was hard because I hadn't expected that. And all I had heard was, with Marquette Method, you can get so many more days that are available to you for sex, even if you're trying to avoid pregnancy. And that just was not my experience. So I wasn't angry at a particular person so much as just frustrated with this being the state of women's health that we're in 2024. We have all these technological advancements in the world around us, and yet this, excuse me, this is the best that we have to offer women. I didn't love that. I don't love that still. Now, you might ask, well, is that it? Like, are those all the options? Well, 1, you can cross-check the Marquette method, just like you can cross-check within Boston cross-check method. But you can cross-check your Clear Blue fertility monitor with these LH strips The brand that I was recommended was Wondfo, WONDFO. But those actually are super cool. They're super cool because they are testing for the LH surge that happens before your ovulation. And I don't know what it was exactly, but I told my husband when I got my first positive LH strip, because you start testing. I mean, I suppose you could test with them every night if you wanted, but I started testing once I got high readings after the 2 months of high, like when a month and a half had gone by, and then I got high readings. I was testing at that time, and I saw the surge because the strips had been negative the night before, and then they were positive. I was just like, babe, my body is ovulating. Like, it's about to ovulate now. I know what's going on inside. It was just very cool. I'm not sure if that's a little nerdier than would be the case for most people, but for me, it was just really cool to see that. And then every cycle after that, to be able to confirm, like, wow, this is so cool. This is what's happening. And I'm pretty confident it's happening based on, what I'm seeing. So anyhow, yes, you can cross-check. And then you can also cross-check with Prove, PROOV strips. And those are a little bit more complicated. They're checking for your progesterone rise that happens about 7 days after ovulation. So the Prove strips are testing for progesterone. The OPK ovulation predictor kits like Wondfo, those are testing for LH, which happens LH surge right around ovulation. So you can cross check with different things. But still, what I think is most interesting for the potential, like for next time, which if you're hearing this, there's going to be a next time. And that means exactly what you think it means. There's going to be a next time in about 7 months. But for next time, there is what's called the Mira monitor, and there's also an Neato monitor, and those are quantitative monitors. So Clear Blue Fertility Monitor has a qualitative reading, high, low, peak. But the Mira and Neato monitors have actual number readouts. And my understanding is that you would have a protocol, which Marquette is developing those right now, so that if your estrogen is above a certain number, that day would be off limits for sex for you if you're trying to avoid pregnancy. And then if it's below a certain threshold, I'm making this up, but let's say 100, then that would be a go day for you. And I don't know if you have to test every day, frankly, because my thought would be, since the monitor is even more expensive than Marquette, and I already know that now, my thought would be, well, could I just use that on days that I was in the mood, for instance, and not just test every single day, because especially with low libido during postpartum, who is interested every day? So that's something that I am considering for the future. And one other thing I was wanting to address, you might hear, or have heard, or be thinking yourself, or maybe this is your experience, what's the point of using NFP at all? Like, shouldn't you just allow as many children as come, essentially? And I do think that that is one approach. And I think if you are being specifically called to that approach, then that's something that you would discern with your husband. My husband and I have discerned that what makes the most sense for us is to listen to what my body is telling us. And I found great comfort in knowing that my husband has no desire to pressure me one way or the other. He's told me after every baby, babe, we're just going to follow what works for your body. So if your body's not healed, if you think there needs to be more time, if mentally or emotionally you say, I'm not ready, we're just going to respect where your body and mind are at, and then we're going to go with that. I think there's a real beauty in the husband's reverence for his wife's welfare in that way, and I think children can tend to come when it's time for them to come if he has that healthy perspective and appreciation for her body and the fact that she disproportionately bears the fruits of their marital love. So that's something that's worked really well for us. And do I think you have to chart all of the time if you are going to be totally open to however many children come? No, I mean, that's up to you. But I absolutely think that you should know how, because of what it can tell you about what's going on in your body. I think every person should be literate and know how to read. And I think every woman should be body literate and know how to tell what's going on in her own body. It just is a measure of her own health. You've probably heard, but the menstrual cycle is a 5th vital sign of health for women. So yeah, if you don't want to chart because you're not trying to conceive or avoid right now, you're trying to whatever, then don't do that, especially if it's stressful or anxiety inducing for you. But definitely know how to do that if you wanted to, and definitely have at least a sense of what's going on in your own body so that you can track your own health for your information, for your welfare. So I hope that's helpful. Oh, one other thing I was thinking was, I also think that I would qualify to use the Lactational Amenorrhea Method, which just has 3 requirements. No bleeding after your bleeding from birth stops. So I think it's after 8 weeks, excuse me. I think no bleeding after 8 weeks up until 6 months. So if your cycle, or excuse me, if you've not had any bleeding since 8 weeks postpartum, if your baby's not yet 6 months old, and if you, excuse me, and if you are feeding the baby every couple of hours during the day and then no longer than 4 to 6 hours stretches of sleep at night, you qualify for the Lactational Amenorrhea Method. And I just think that would be so much less nerve-wracking and frustrating for me, as long as I qualify to just continue, to do that. So I suspect that is what I will do the next time. And then I'll probably do a cross-check with either Mira or the Marquette Method at some point. My goodness, lady, that should be plenty. That should be more than enough for today. So if you have questions, you can reach me at annemarie@postpartumonpurpose.com. And then next week, we're going to talk about big sibling rivalry or big sibling jealousy of the baby. Talk to you then.